pressed it. Yeah, I got it on your screen. That's yours. Okay, so the purpose of this meeting, we had a few talks on papers on causality, and even like deep learning, we talk about all the time, and even if it was confusing for people in the beginning, now, even though I don't think I understand anything about deep learning, but at least I kind of feel comfortable with it. I got used to it. But causality is
because no one understands deep learning.
Well, some people think they understand deep learning. Right? Some people write grants pretending they will understand deep learning. But nevertheless, causality, we had 3 papers, and then we had David give a talk without a paper, and it still felt like, what's that thing? And so since David is here, and by the way, announcement, David is giving a talk at 1 right next door, totally not on causality, on ethics and AI, because David is a philosopher. David is an interesting breed. Is a philosopher, proven track record, psychologist, proven track record, and machine learner, proven track record, with some proven track record of intersections of those. So somehow, I don't know, what is interdisciplinary? But nevertheless, so the next talk is at 1 p.m. But now let's have a discussion, and any question about causality that you have, or I finally can ask, because yeah, sometimes most often I need to pretend that I know what I'm talking about. But now I can ask you basic questions as well. We don't have to put David on the spot. We can start our side discussions as we often do. And,
Side discussions.
No, you're famous for that. So okay, causality. I don't even know how to start, but if anyone has a question, but at least there are 2 things in causality that annoy me when people ask me, "Oh, you're interested in causality? How do you estimate this causal effect?" I'm like, I don't care. I'm interested in the causal discovery, to discover the causal structure. It's not that I even know the methods of estimating, given the causal structure, how large will be causal effect if you intervene. Those are the kind of questions. So is there any a standard 2-minute introduction? But I don't think people here have problems with the kind of introduction. It's more of the technical, but how do you even approach that? What does it mean?
I want to second that question by saying that my biggest thing that I wanted to bring up was, some of the so-called metrics that we use for estimating causality, Granger causality, and transfer and all of these things, and how they might align or unalign with different sort of views. If you're very skeptical of causality, it's sort of Humean fashion, or you want to take a very much harder view of causality. It'd be interesting to kind of hear your thoughts on some of the metrics as well, and how they line up with how you can talk about causality at all.
Is Granger causality even causality? It's like that. I don't know. Where would you
Granger causality is causality if the world cooperates. So many of the standard tools that we use, many of the standard technical methods, especially in the context of time series data, basically presuppose a particular causal structure, and then they're doing some variant on maximum likelihood estimation or Bayesian estimation, usually with some kind of uninformative, perhaps improper prior, over the parameters in that fixed structure. So Granger causality is a classic example of that. It assumes a particular structure and assumes basically linear relationships between the past and the current time, and then does estimation. Okay. So in that sense, a lot of the standard methods for causal effect size estimation and these sorts of things are a lot like ordinary regression, which assumes a particular parametric model, and then you're estimating parameters within that model, right? So it's a very sort of, I don't want to say simplistic, but it's a standard thing in statistics that you'll assume a model or assume some small class of models if you're doing model selection, and then you just estimate parameters in. And most of the literature, most of the things that people do under the heading of causal effect size estimation are exactly of that same form. So when Sergey is talking about not caring about it, it's because the space of causal models is super exponential in the number of factors you have. And so it's really annoying to do estimation across the entire class of models. You really want to shrink that class of models down to a few things, and then you can estimate causal effects within that. But you know, something like Granger causality, instead of using data-driven restriction in the model space, restricts the model space in other ways so that it's now a tractable estimation problem. But in the case of Granger causality, you can do that because you've got time. You've got the past, you've got the present. So there's a whole bunch of models that you just don't even consider. Other ways you can do it that you often will find is so people will do things like try to estimate things like what is the ACE, the average causal effect. But when you do ACE estimation, you're not, people will say, well, yes, well, I don't have to do causal discovery. I don't have to look for a model because I'm just trying to do ACE. And the problem is that, or the difference is when you do that kind of estimation of the average causal effect, almost always it's for a particular variable. So I want to know what's the average causal effect of this policy manipulation on longevity, on average, why am I drawing a blank on the word, the term? How long people normally live.
Expectation.
Life expectancy, thank you, jeez, or post-infancy life expectancy, right? So that's a kind of standard thing that people want to know in the social sciences and in policy domains. So you see things like ACE estimation, total effect estimation, and various other methods that people have developed, some of which are really robust and powerful that can handle, you know, when your data come from lots of different countries, for example, which is the kind of standard problem in econometrics. But they do it by saying, I don't care about lots of other causal models. All I care about are those that, you know, in some sense, I don't care about any causal model that says there are downstream effects of this target. Because I'm trying to figure out what the levers are that I have access to influence the target, such as post-infancy life expectancy. So yeah, so that's where a lot of these techniques are getting, you know, as in so many things, if you restrict the model class, you make the estimation problem tractable. A lot of the causal discovery work is just a first stage to restrict the model class, at which point all of these things kick in, right? So it's very normal in some of the applications I do where we'll use causal discovery to get a small set of models, and then we use things like Granger causality or other estimation techniques given those models. We'll even use Granger when it's not time series data because the math still works.
But I think if the problem is also with the language and like model estimation. Well, how is that different than just fitting a model? Like, why is it causal? Like, what is the, so what you're saying, okay, we have a graph or we don't have a graph. Now we just fit the parameters. Well, if we compute the Bayesian score, we feed it a probability distribution of some sort. Why is it causal? Is causal a notion again just the talking point, or is causal actually in the data? That's like, can you nail like drilling it? I don't know. Like, what is like? How to distinguish a non-causal from a causal model? Because the language is the same. Estimation, model, data, everything is the same. We feed the model.
Yeah. So,
I
just
I just wanted to add on to that because it very fits with my question, which is like, do you think intervention is necessary for causality? Because that I think Judea Pearl, for example, says like you need to do sort of like, you know, operator. That makes it different from like statistics and model fitting normally. I think that's like his, I see it on Twitter sometimes, that's where people are like, you need intervention to say it's causal, otherwise it's just fitting.
It's not necessary.
No, some people say that. I mean, I'm not saying that that's my.
So what I would say is that, so many sort of just pieces here, right? What makes some mathematical representation a causal model is that it is legitimate to apply the do operator, or whatever your preferred thing is, to generate counterfactuals and post-intervention probabilities for at least some of the factors in the model. Right? So I can have a model that's sort of what I would call semantically heterogeneous. Some parts of it I give a causal interpretation to, but some parts of the exact same mathematical model I don't. The exact same mathematical thing, you can give a causal interpretation to or a non-causal one. It's like, what do you think it's legitimate to do with this model? In fact, an amusing story is, or I think it's amusing, but I have a weird sense of humor, is so this, one of the original modeling frameworks was causal, we called it at the time causal Bayes nets. But Bayes nets, there's a non-causal interpretation to them. In fact, in 1988, Yuta Pearl wrote a whole book on Bayesian networks that right at the beginning, he says in big letters, these are not to be interpreted causally. Right? Because in 1988, we didn't yet know how to do what we would now call the do operator. We didn't have all the theorems and proofs that showed us, oh, here's a way to represent interventions within this graphical model structure. So the exact same mathematical thing could be causal or not, depending on whether I think it is legitimate to use the do operator on it. Now, why would I think that that's legitimate? Well, one reason might be because of very specific domain assumptions. I might know, here's the only things that could be causes of this, because I know that, some of this is, I might know, for example, that broad aspects of the community I live in are not directly causing my activation levels in my hippocampus. So if you found that people in different communities had differing levels of activation in their hippocampus, you might go, all right, there's an association there, there's a statistical thing I can use, but it's probably not causal. It's probably not the sort of thing where if I intervened on Sergey's community by moving him to another place, that's going to instantly change hippocampal activation. I'm trying to come up with something that's, you can imagine having in the same data set, but that nobody would actually have thought was necessarily causal. More typically, what we're dealing with are, in the case of things like Granger causality, we say, well, we've got time order. So this is the sense in which, Sergey says Granger causality is not causality. Well, yeah, because when we say Granger causality, what we mean is a particular estimation method. What makes it Granger causal is if I think that I've measured all of the appropriate factors, there's no unobserved common causes of the things in my system that I failed to measure, then the time order gets me the directionality. And so it is legitimate to do operators on it. But there's a background assumption. I measured everything that matters. In the same way, regression, which is one of just the common things that people point at, that it's just correlation, that never tells you causation. Regression is perfectly good at telling you causation if you know you measured everything relevant. It actually is, and these are the potential causes. Here's right. So there it's domain knowledge. Finally, what you might have is and this is sort of where people get, I think, a little nervous. I don't, but they get nervous, is in sort of the garden variety causal discovery methods. Because here, what we're doing is we're saying, well, all I'm going to assume is that if there's a causal relationship, it should show up in the statistics in this kind of general way. And then I say, well, but then the only way to explain the entire pattern of statistics that I'm seeing is in terms of certain causal relationships. So I'm deliberately trying to use sort of minimal assumptions. So I still need something, because I'm not just trying to represent the joint probability distribution. I want to be able to have something that I can legitimately infer post-intervention probabilities. But to do it, I have to make some kind of additional assumptions. And that makes people often nervous because they don't, how do you test the assumption? Well, some of the assumptions we can test, some of them we can't.
Are you talking about Markov and faithfulness?
Yeah, so things like Markov and faithfulness or other variants on those. But yeah, the things that let us say, well, if you have this kind of probability structure, then these are the only causal things that could explain why you're seeing that probability structure. Right? Which we do actually in science all the time. Like there's the very ordinary scientific inference rule that if two things are independent, if there's no informational connection between them, then there's no direct causal connection between them, unless I didn't collect enough data, or there's like an exactly counterbalancing mechanism, or, but so what do we do in science? We say, well, I can test whether I have enough data. I might have domain knowledge about whether there's exactly counterbalancing or redundant mechanisms. And so this is basically the same thing. We just, take that simple inference rule that we use all the time in science and scale it up to lots and lots of variables and big structures. I mean, that's another way to think about it, is it's basically taking what we do in science all the time. If they're independent, we don't think there's a causal connection unless there's these sort of defeaters, these alternative things. If there is a correlation, we think there might be a causal connection unless there's these things. Some of the unless are things we can test, some are things that we just have to assume. And we do that, we do that all the time. All right, take those two sort of rules, make them precise and scale them up to handle thousands of variables simultaneously rather than just two. That's like literally, that's what causal discovery algorithms are from a philosophy of science perspective.
Yeah, but
But I don't know if any of that answers. I'm sorry, I went on a
I was just
rant.
wondering, like, so being a rigorous scientist kind of makes you someone who is interested in causality, almost by definition. If you talk to experts. right,
Yes,
about-
scientists care about
If
causality.
you pre-register your, I guess, if you pre-register your research, you could almost call whatever, if you find it's aligned with your pre-registration, it almost is causal, right? Because you explain the mechanisms by which you think it's going to happen. And so if you then you make the assumption, right, that it is causal by pre-registering in a way.
Well, it depends. I mean, I can pre-register a purely statistical study.
No, sure. I'm just
I mean,
talking
I can
about
be
like,
looking for diagnostic
Right.
features where I don't think that they're going to be
Right.
causal at all.
right, sure. But let's say I say like, okay, I think structural MRI is, yeah, I guess it's a little bit different to say causal than just we can find schizophrenia from let's say a structural MRI scan.
Yeah, so actually, I think that that's an important thing. If what I want to do is diagnose schizophrenia, then that requires different kinds of knowledge than if I want to predict the time course of schizophrenia. It's different from the knowledge I need to intervene and try and treat schizophrenia. And I can do studies for any of those. In fact, we have a draft paper that but I am a former student, need to get back out the door. It's in an R&R. Where part of what we're doing is trying to explain sort of within cognitive neuroscience, here's all these different goals you might have. Here's the different kinds of knowledge you need for them. And here are the different classes of methods that reveal that kind of knowledge. Right. And the point is, it's not that causation is yay, that's causation's like the gold standard or the best. Sometimes we don't need causal knowledge. We don't care about that. And that's fine as scientists. Let's just make sure we know what we're trying to do when we do a scientific study. We're trying to answer this question requires this kind of knowledge, so you have to use methods appropriately.
That's why I was talking about pre-registration.
Yeah.
Because you need to be very upfront about the type of hypotheses
Yes.
you have.
Yes.
Then you can start to go down the route potentially of causality if you have the right data.
Yeah. So that's what I mean, my own view, now it's a little bit going down a rabbit hole, but my own view is that that's what pre-registration is really good for. It forces you to figure, it's also about the statistical power, but it's really about, here's what I'm trying to do with this study. I can't now go, well, that didn't work, but let me see if I can use it for, I can look to see if there might have been some other question I could have answered with it.
Mhm.
But I have to recognize that I probably made a lot of choices in the design of the study that were shaped by what my goal was. And so if I want to ask a different question, if I want to have a different goal, I'd better go back and redo the design. Because what I did was almost certainly suboptimal for the question I was trying to ask.
I have a comment on the do question. When either Pearl talks about do and when David was talking about do operator, it's not an actual experiment. It's a hypothetical counterfactual.
No, I understand, but I think there are people that say, like, for example, if you want to know, like, yeah, if you want to know if a drug works, you can't just do sort of like a population study and kind of infer from that, that maybe it works, right? You need to like give some people the drug and some people not the drug, and then you need to look at what the result is from.
But
Well, so,
It's
so,
not
yeah, so I
really
guess I
true.
would push back, or I would say it in the following way. I think in general, I think we can figure out, we can make legitimate inferences about the do operator
Sure.
from purely observational data. I think
No, I
that
know
the
that.
cases of pharmaceuticals and health conditions almost never satisfy the assumptions where we could do that. So I think that people, my own view is that people are actually right when they say from a population observational study, you should never really be making treatment recommendations. You really do have to do the clinical trial. I think that's right, not because in principle it couldn't be, but just because in practice, we never measure all the stuff we would really need to know. We don't, the assumptions that are required to go from pure observational data to high confidence do predictions.
Right.
The assumptions you need to do that are almost never true in this case, but it's a domain specific thing. That's the part that I get frustrated by, is that people get, and I'm not saying this was you, right? But I think people get, they infer from the fact that we need to do that, we need to do clinical trials here, means we have to do clinical trials in poverty economics,
Right.
or in, you know, agriculture, where actually those, the kinds of things that we worry about with pharmaceuticals, in many cases don't arise.
Right, I think the reason why I've seen so many people say that we need more interventional data is because in neuroscience, a lot of people do the reverse, which is like infer causality from observational data where they probably don't fit this.
Where they shouldn't.
I think that's why people are like, you better just be like safe and get observational data, because we know for get like interventional data, because we know for sure that we can then we can make stronger assumptions, right? Like, and have a stronger sense of whether it's causal or not. Because yeah, I know obviously like you don't need per se interventional data. It's one of the, I guess, like rungs on the ladder, right? Of like causality is Judea role.
Yeah,
Puts it-
we buy into the Pearl
Right.
framework.
But yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I also don't think you per se need interventional data, but I think more and more people are pushing for it because it makes it so much easier and believable, I think, because in an observational model, obviously people have disagreements about like what the actual causal like variables could be, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we have questions of what are the right variables for the causal model from a purely observational study. In the case of neuroscience also, we know, I mentioned that sort of unless caveat, which one of them was there's redundant or counterbalancing mechanisms. We know that those are all over the place in the human body. We call it homeostasis, right? I mean, so we know that biology, including neuroscience, is filled with these things that make it hard to go from inference to, from observation to intervention. So yeah, I've got no problem with that. I should just say, so the Pearl and others sort of have this idea of rungs that sort of you're moving up in terms of what you can do. My objection to that is actually there are times that causal knowledge makes it harder to do some of the things that are lower. Like the way that he talks in terms of rungs suggests that it's always better to get higher on the ladder. And actually it's not. Sometimes you're better off. If what you want to do is just do a simple diagnostic classificatory model, like just build that. Don't worry about causality in a lot of cases. It can help if you're doing domain transfer generalization, but it isn't always the case that you should be trying to build, that one should try to build a causal model. I guess that's.
Yeah, I kind of have to ask then, so for these kind of high level classification models, I tend to argue that it would be a service to both the end goal of the model and the interpretation of its results and how well it's working and diagnosis of bugs and potential safety issues and stuff, that people do have some at least level of causal understanding of these like classificatory models. It's the danger when we have a model making a decision and we don't actually know what mechanism that is actually detecting, if at all. that we run into, sort of various ethical quandaries, right, in medicine.
Yeah. Oh, no, so I 100% agree. But there's an important distinction there, which is I can have a causal understanding of a non-causal model. I can also have a non-causal understanding of a causal model, but let's focus on that first one, right? So what you're describing is the importance of having a causal understanding of the model itself. But the model that I'm using for prediction or classification need not be describing the causality in the world.
Right. I see what you're saying.
And I mean, part of the reason I bring this up is because it's actually one of the, in the field, in the area of sort of explainable AI, it's actually something where I find there's a lot of ambiguity in what XAI papers, how they talk in many cases, because they're ambiguous about whether what they're trying to get at is a causal understanding of the model or a causal understanding of the world that is presumably reflected in some way in the model. And those are just two, obviously those, when you say it that way, it's like, well, yeah, of course, those are different things. You can have a causal understanding of sort of the code versus the causal understanding of the brain, the squishy gray stuff. But it's tricky because a lot of the things, Lime, just use, probably one of the most famous XAI tools, Lime is not a way to get a causal understanding of the world. It's a way to get a causal understanding of a model. And if the world differs from the model in certain ways, then it can actually be really misleading if we base policy decisions on that. For scientific purposes, though, you're right. I mean, if we're going to be deploying this, doctors need to understand why the system, they need to understand that this diagnosis depended on this symptom. Even if we're not sure why that symptom matters in the world. We may not know why this is something that matters all that much. We just know that it does.
Yeah, that's very much what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Yep. Can incomplete models be causal? Like knowingly incomplete? Like, let's say the brain, right, is like super hard in terms of like the number of variables you would probably need to describe the full causal relationship of why things happen in the brain, just because it's so complex. So you're always going to have only a subset. Does that make it non-causal or?
Yeah, that's no. I mean, so there's several different kinds of incomplete that we might have in mind. So one sense of incomplete is the sense in which all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? You can never measure everything. Right? You're always going to omit some stuff. So, but that, the fact that, it doesn't make it I can say that switch, I don't know which switches. A switch causes the state of the lights, even though I haven't actually measured the current in the wires.
Fair, but
right?
like,
So that's the sort of simple one, right? Then there's the cases where what we are doing is we're omitting, potential, say, common causes. And there, well, it might be that there's a potential common cause that I've missed between these two variables, but not these other two, in which case I feel secure about the causality here. I might be uncertain about the part over in this model, this part of the model. It's also the case that, the statistics might tell me there's almost certainly not a common cause here. That I was uncertain about it, and actually the statistics tell me it probably wouldn't work. And then the sort of third way that I think we can think of incompleteness of the model is I might say, I don't know what's going on between these guys, right? My model is precise here. So in some sense there, I might be considering, say, 8 different models, all of which agree on this part of the model, but disagree on this other part. So that's another sense of incompleteness. And I think that one also, I wouldn't trust any causal claims over the incomplete part. It could be perfectly fine in the part where all of my models agree.
That's right. Yeah, I guess because we have like genetics data that often is not used, for example, or like physiological data, which we know relates as well, right? Like they're probably common cause because they both influence the brain and potentially mental disorders. So we know that they exist, it's just that it's very hard to like gather it all. So.
Yeah, well, can you add a comment before we go to an online question? And if you have a microphone online, it's easier to just ask. But one of the exciting things for me in causal discovery, that subpart of causal learning, is that there are methods where you can find a structure where you have confidence on this causal parts of the causal interactions are actually there, and parts of the interactions are questionable. Like, okay, I can tell you that A causes B and A causes C, but I don't know whether C causes D or not. So go and do an experiment. So like, I don't need to do tons of other experiments now because my space is limited, and it's kind of a guidance for experiments, and then I improve my model. Or I don't do a specific intervention experiment if I cannot, but I collect more data of unobserved causes that I think, okay, that's what is causing that relation. So
Or
it's
you
kind of
look,
a
or you look
guide.
for natural experiments. I mean, I will just say, I think that's one of the, maybe not in cognitive neuroscience, but certainly in the social sciences, natural experiments are sort of they're not sufficiently explored in terms of the statistics of it. There are people who think about how to
Can you define?
Sorry, natural experiment is where, the world changes things. So say a global pandemic hits and shuts, massively changes our economic structure, right? Can think of these as, random shocks. Now, a global pandemic is a shock that hits a bunch of different variables all at once. So it's hard to make inferences and learn from what happens when lots of things are influenced, right? Normally we think about clinical trials, experiments as being very targeted. We're going to pick one thing and randomize it, whether you take a drug, whether you're told and given access to, told to take a drug and given access to it, which of course we know partial compliance is always a problem. But natural experiments are things where the world basically does an experiment, usually on multiple factors all at once. So learning is much harder. On the other hand, you don't have the ethical issues, right? I mean, obviously it would have been unethical to say, let's see what happens if we launch a global pandemic. Right? Obviously, no IRB is signing off on that. Sorry, I'm trying to lighten the mood a little bit with pandemic jokes. Too soon, I guess. But given that it happened, can we take advantage of the fact that there was this large shock to the system to learn something?
That's what the Stanford professor got Nobel Prize for, right? In economics, I think.
Yeah, so the most recent one, a big part of it was looking at natural experiments, and those can also be things like, perhaps the most famous one in econometrics is when I believe it. I think I may be getting them backwards, but New Jersey raised its minimum wage, but Pennsylvania did not. And those states border each other. And so you can just look at things like, does the employment rate change in neighboring towns? Right. So New Jersey does this just single change. We're going to raise our minimum wage. People had long thought that raising the minimum wage would also increase unemployment, because businesses would say, well, we're not going to hire as many people because we have a fixed budget for our personnel. And so when New Jersey does this, there's a sort of, you've got all these matched pairs on either side of the river, because there's a river that runs down the boundary between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So these towns are, in almost every way you would hope to find, matched, except one's in New Jersey and one's in Pennsylvania. And so you can actually start to figure out, does the minimum wage cause unemployment? And the short answer is no, it doesn't.
We have this question.
But anyway.
Could you give an example of non-causal model from the conventional machine learning models? Can I say masked RCNN is a non-causal model?
Yeah, so I mean, a very simple example of a non-causal model would be a decision tree. So decision trees are sort of a classic non-causal model because they'll generate predictions, but you can't, as is sort of well known, if I take a person, say I've got a decision tree for some diagnosis, and I can surrogate through it and come up with an answer. But if I intervene to change one of his factors, that won't necessarily change what actually happens, right? It might change the diagnosis. This goes to Bradley's question, right? Because the model will have changed. But the decision trees don't support these kinds of, if I intervene in the world, what will happen? They don't give us the right answer. In general, deep learning is an entirely non-causal model, right? Deep networks are, in general, non-causal. Because, I mean, we can think of them as causal machines, but what they're telling us about the world is not information about causality. Right, so if you have a bunch of factors that you provide, you train up a net on, there's no particular reason to think that if you intervene in the world to change the value of those input factors, the model will still give you an answer, but there's no reason to think that that answer, that prediction will be correct.
Well, let's argue there. So in 2012-13, there was this play at Google playing with a model called Inception, where they looked at what factors in the data influence the model prediction and kind of run gradient descent on the data rather than the parameters of the model by increasing, or you can do decreasing, like, okay, change the data so that the prediction changes. So in that sense of causal relationship between like the data and prediction, but it's causal in the sense that we know where to intervene, what in data we need to change in order for the diagnosis or prediction of the model.
Yeah, so that's, well, so again, that goes back to Bradley's question / point, right? Deep networks are causal machines, right? In the sense of, they have their mechanisms and you can intervene on the inputs and change the outputs by doing that. But that causal machinery does not mirror the causal structure.
Yeah, in the world, it does not.
And so there's a sense in which they are causal machines, but it's not, I think it is problematic if we refer to them as causal models, because for better and for worse, the term causal model has come to mean a model of the causality in the world.
So this reminds me of a paper that Lloyd kind of covered, where it was like somebody was playing with an RNN inside of a video game, and they were like trying to learn basically like the state transitions to build an AI that could play in the latent space, but then they would kind of correlate to the real world. I mean, is that kind of, and it's a reinforcement learning thing. So there's interventions. I mean, is that kind of approaching causality or?
Yeah, so reinforcement learning systems, when they're placed into simulated environments, will learn a certain kind of causal knowledge, namely the effects of their own actions in that simulated in silico environment. The reason I have all those hedges is because one of the problems with reinforcement learners, or one of the challenges with reinforcement learners, is they can be really good at learning what actions they should do, but it can be hard for them to do things like learn from other agents' actions, right? So we humans can learn a lot by watching each other do stuff. That's tricky for reinforcement learners to do, because it depends on you have to know something about the state of the system in terms of why it chose the action it did. Not hard for us as humans, because theory of mind, it is hard for generic RL. It's also the case that the RL system has to be able to act in order to learn. It can't watch and then do the right action. It's not without a lot of modification. So RL systems are getting at some causal information about the environment within which they are learning. But it is limited in other ways, I guess what I would say. And look, I mean, a lot of different methods that we use in ML, we hope that the model will mirror the world. Right? I mean, that's part of what we're trying to do oftentimes. It's just with causality, and so pretty much always your model is going to mirror the statistical structure of the world. That's usually what we mean when we say we've got a good fitting model. The problem is that natural mirroring that we're used to thinking about on the statistical side does not carry over to the causal.
An interesting kind of a controversial point. There was just a PNAS paper came out like 2 days ago or so, which is called Predicting Network Dynamics Without Requiring the Knowledge of the Interaction Graph. And that's kind of a question, David, to you or everyone. When we read Sholkov's paper on, what is it, causal representations, the first thing that he's talking about, and physicists in the room probably support, is that if we know differential equations that generate behavior of the system, this is the ultimate causal model. What this paper that I just said shows is that, okay, we can fit and predict perfectly time series by having totally unrelated interaction system that is not related to the one that generates the signal, but we can have very like high prediction accuracy.
It's more assume that if the nodes are estimated correctly, that is a big assumption that actually the paper makes. But if the nodes are assumed correctly, the interactions are not estimated correctly, can we capture the dynamics of the network? So, and they show, yeah, based on different assumptions they can, but it has a lot of assumption. That's what I'm saying, that it has a lot of assumption about that. So it assumes that the nodes are estimated correctly. That is the biggest one, right? We usually do not have that too, so.
And is that, so they're assuming that the nodes are correctly identified. So is it then just using sort of the standard embedding stuff from the dynamical embedding stuff from the 80s and 90s?
So essentially I think what they did exactly, they first assumed that the system is on a pairwise network, right? That is assumption that it's not a high order network. So it's a pairwise network. And they said that we have the data of the nodes, right? But we do not have the correct interaction between them. And then they have several models of dynamic. I don't exactly know the name. They have I think, table that explain the models that they use. And then they say, oh, if we use this model, this model, this model, and this model, can we get the dynamics of these different models without having the network? I don't know if, I think Lotke Voltra model, I don't know, there are several models that they have.
Okay, I mean, certainly, there were a lot of techniques developed, especially in the 90s for analyzing nonlinear dynamical systems that I think it'd be interesting to go back and revisit some of those, 25 years later to see what things could be updated or brought forward, because especially for these kinds of cases where you don't have all of the variables, you might only have a single variable, but if it's a sufficiently interconnected dynamical system, that one variable, a time series of that one variable actually will reveal a lot of features of the dynamics of the full multivariate system.
That sounds like what you're trying to predict from just one variable to predict the interactions from others, from one node. Variable, we mean a node in the graph.
Yeah, but it's a little different because you do use the gradients flow back from the other nodes, right? So you
Okay, so there's some leakage.
So
well, I wouldn't say leakage, but more like specific, you're learning a relationship between time series types.
I actually wanted, because we actually talked about this between, I was discussing this. This is very important. Then estimating the nodes is very, because we don't have that. We never have network. We do not measure networks. We measure point clouds, right? We do not have ability to measure the network directly. So even the node estimation, to assume that it's correct, is a very big assumption usually. So that is what I want to add, is that that paper is very interesting, but the assumption is not a very practical assumption, because that's usually never happens. So
I disagree about the last statement. It almost always happens because we have already, like, say, temperature. Yeah, temperature is, what is temperature? It's an emergent phenomenon. You can think about how to derive thermodynamics from scratch, but we don't need to. We feel it. Evolution solved that problem. We know there is some quantity that is called temperature. And when we want to establish causal relationship of temperature something else, we already have the variable. It's temperature. It's kind of, or whatever you feel by that. I disagree that we have to always start from scratch, like in the voxel space of the brain. Like, what are the variables? Yes, I agree.
No, measuring. How do you measure network brain directly? You do not. We never measure.
For the brain, I agree, but not everywhere. This is not necessarily a common. Like, we're still in a very bad shape, even when we know that there is thing called temperature, there is thing called height, there's thing called this, we're still like need science or, you know, hundreds of years to discover relationships between those, causal relationships between those. Like the problem of nodes is figuring out the nodes from sensorial collection of like pixel type measurements is a hard problem by itself, but the next problem is not easier. And like you don't always have to solve them both together, not in all situations. Just solving the causal problem relationship between nodes is important by itself. But like if you don't think about econometrics or sociology, what are the groups? What are those variables? You don't know. You're just measuring individual people running around doing something, but you're interested in latent factors, those variables, which you don't even know what they are. Well, it would be nice to discover them rather than define, prescribe. Sorry, Ashley.
Do you think causality is necessary for intelligence? And if so, do you think we can only get like intelligent, whatever? Yeah, I don't think that's like, but I'm just wondering from a philosophical perspective, if that's necessary. Do you think that if we make like like an intelligent agent, it needs to be embodied? Because we were talking about reinforcement learning, and I guess, right, like
Intervention.
right, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, to understand causal structures, like it as an agent, it probably helps to be able to interact with the world, because it's not necessary.
It doesn't have to be embodied, but interact with the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think interaction with the world is certainly necessary. How embodied that interaction needs to be, I have much less certainty in my views. I do think that that intelligence requires that. I also think it is necessary for something to be a sort of big I intelligent system. It needs to be something that can act in the world, not just passively receive. And if you're going to intelligently act in the world, you have to have an understanding of causality, or yourself and others as causal agents.
So the answer is yes.
So I think the answer is yes, but it's in this sort of funny way, right? I mean, I think we can have systems that are capable of doing incredibly cool stuff. That, you know, do we want to call it capital I intelligent? Maybe not, but they're really powerful, valuable things that don't have causality. So.
Do you think there are restrictions on how it should interact with the world? Like if you want to understand physics, like I guess like how kids understand physics is to just like make a block and then let it fall and they understand now, okay, well, you know. I guess like if let's say you can't interact physically with the world, how would that help you understand the causal structure in the world? Like if you could only, let's say, post on the internet.
Well, I think what you would understand, I think you would come to understand the causal structure of communication networks on the internet, right?
Okay.
Which are a very different thing, right? The communication networks in physical space are bounded by things like distance, right? You know, and latency plays a bigger role in physical communication than in electronic, for example.
So we could, let's say it exists, we could restrict it to only understand. Like really understand, I guess like the thing that it can interact with.
Yeah, which I think is important when you think about some of the ethical worries that are sometimes raised about things like superintelligent systems. Is well, we can bound their interaction, their domains of interaction with the world.
You're going to talk about it at the talk next.
Superintelligence?
Yeah. Okay.
But
Well,
but I would like to have a couple minutes before.
Yes,
that.
yes, it's a nice,
talk,
it's a nice moment to end this discussion. Thanks everyone for coming, and let's move to the next link. Those who have it, JSU, WebEx, or next room. That's where David will talk about something else. Thanks.